Welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. I'm Kate Dickerson. Today's episode is a conversation I had with Curt Brown, marine biologist for Ready Seafood. I've been a fan of Curt's for years and was overjoyed when he agreed to talk to me for the podcast. Curt's love of the ocean and deep, passionate eloquence about science is apparent almost instantly. My only regret regarding our conversation is that we had to stop it. Two quick notes for our listeners who don't live in Maine. DMR is the Department of Marine Resources, and when Curt mentions Western Maine, that's Casco Bay, where Portland is located. Our conversation was recorded in January 2025. I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. So Curt, welcome to the Maine Science Podcast. Unbeknownst to you, I've been a fan and a follower for many years now, just kind of watching from the sidelines all the cool stuff you're doing. So I'm really grateful that you're here. One of the coolest things I think that you do as a marine biologist, I actually don't remember exactly which title. I think I've seen both. And a lobsterman, like you are bridging this really interesting divide that people often don't think about. So we will get into that. But first, I was kind of hoping you could give me some of your background. Like, what was it that made you fall in love with doing the science of marine life and marine biology?
Oh, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. Right back at you. I've been a huge fan of this podcast, and I think it's always amazing when we can communicate science in a way that resonates with folks, because so often science is seen as this complicated process, when in reality, I just see science as making observations and asking questions and trying to figure out the answer to those questions. And ultimately, that often just leads to more questions. And it's just such a simple, eloquent process that allows us to engage with the world around us in a very different way. So I'll stop waxing idiotic on my feelings on science and try and answer your question, but thank you very, very much for having me. So to your question, I was born right here in Maine, grew up in Cape Elizabeth, was very fortunate to have a family right near the water. My grandparents had an old cottage right on the coast of Cape Elizabeth, and my father had a little wooden skiff and some old beat up wooden traps back when we used to fish wooden traps as an industry. And he did it as a hobby. And so he'd get home from work and I'd be waiting with bated breath, pun intended, to go out in the boat and haul traps. And I can assure you that as an 8, 9, 10-year-old kid in Maine, there's nothing more magical than seeing traps come up from the bottom of the ocean full of lobsters and crabs, but all these other amazing critters as well. And it was those experiences out on the water off the coast of Cape Elizabeth that sparked my fascination in science before I even realized that it was a fascination with science. It was just a fascination with the ocean environment. And there was nowhere in the world as a kid that I would rather be than out on the ocean. Just a magical playground full of things, even in your wildest imagination as a kid, you couldn't even imagine. I mean, I'll never forget the first time I saw a monkfish. Like, what a strange looking critter. And what the heck is that doing on the bottom of the ocean? How does that survive? How does that live? Sea urchins. I mean, those look like something out of Super Mario Brothers. And that's truthfully what really sparked my interest in science. Like I said, before I even realized it was an interest in science. I was never a good student growing up. Any of my teachers can testify to that for sure. I never had any confidence in my abilities as a student. And it wasn't really until I got to high school, my junior year in high school, there was a marine biology class being taught, but only the smart kids could get into it. And I wasn't one of those smart kids. So I had to really fight and get letters from some other teachers and letters from my parents to allow me to take that class, because that's the one thing academically that I was interested in. And I'll never forget it. The teacher, Miss Richmond, Sue Richmond, who taught at Cape back in the day and is now at South Portland High School, she was a very difficult teacher. I remember students that had taken biology with her just said, oh, her tests are the hardest in the world and such a difficult class. So I knew I was up against it, but I really wanted to take that class because it was the one thing that I was really passionate about. And it was the first time in my academic career that I actually developed any confidence in my abilities, because all these smart kids in that class, I was running circles around them because it was all stuff I was familiar with. And that's really what gave me any level of confidence in my abilities as a scientist. And I took that and went on to college and studied history and biology because I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do. In my head, I just wanted to keep lobstering. Unfortunately, at the end of high school, my parents gave me a swift kick in the butt and said, you need to go to college before you decide that lobstering is all you're going to do. Not that there's anything wrong with that. And I still lobster to this day, and it's a wonderful occupation. But I was very fortunate that my parents pushed me. And it was a similar experience where I got my butt kicked in cell biology and chemistry and physics. But then there was a term abroad where we studied the marine biology and marine policy in Woods Hole, and then we went to Bermuda and then up to Newfoundland. And it was the same thing. I regained that confidence in my ability because I was studying something I was passionate about. And I know I'm rambling and probably providing too much information, but I think for students listening to this podcast, it's really important to understand that you don't have to be the smartest person in the room. You just have to be passionate about what you do to be a good scientist. And I'm not saying I'm a good scientist by any means, but like, to have a career in this field, you have to be passionate about it. You're not going to go out and make all the money in the world as a scientist, but you are going to have a fulfilling career doing amazing things. And when I graduated from college, I was fortunate enough to be accepted to an internship at Maine's Marine Lab. And growing up in Maine, I wanted to go to undergraduate outside of Maine. I had no desire to go to Maine. And after undergraduate, I got an internship at Maine's Marine Lab, the Darling Marine Center, right near Damariscotta. And I remember driving down the road my first day of that internship and just being blown away by this location and the facilities and realizing this is a place I want to spend more time at. And having spent that summer as an intern and then 4 years as a graduate student studying marine biology and marine policy, I realized that that was a magical place. And Maine has some of the most amazing facilities that I can speak of. I can't say enough good things about the university. And it progressed from really humble beginnings along the coast of Maine, making observations and asking questions, to me being able to get 2 master's degrees in marine biology and marine policy, continue lobstering all the way through. And here I am. But that's what science can do for you. It's a ticket to the rest of the world. You can study lobsters right here in Maine, or you could study coral reefs all around the world. And science really allows you to do that. And in my occupation now, I can get into more details, but I'll stop rambling for now and we can get back to a Q&A. But I just get really passionate about here in Maine and what we have out on the ocean, and being able to study it is probably one of the privileges of my life for sure.
Okay, so first of all, you're not rambling. This is awesome. Like, I have so many things to go with here. First, I think it's really interesting that you had this experience as a kiddo with your dad to see what is actually in the ocean, because I've been fortunate enough to talk to a bunch of people all over the state and the things that they do. And one of the things that Bigelow scientists in particular have to figure out is how do they explain their work when so often what they're dealing with is microscopic. So not only is it the ocean, which most of us don't get to see underneath, but then it's microscopic, right? So you had this extraordinary experience where you got to see like what the ocean has to offer from an ecological standpoint. Like, how could that not impact you? So there's that. And I appreciate what you said about education and having a teacher really pushed you in finding your passion. I'm curious why you studied biology and not diving right into marine sciences as an undergrad. Is it that you didn't know that was an option, or was that advice? I'm just curious, like, it was so clear to me when you were talking that ocean, ocean life, marine sciences. And then when you said biology, I was like, that's interesting.
Yeah, that's a great question. And it had everything to do with like the college application process. Like I said, as I was going through that, I was so resistant to the idea of actually going to college. I didn't want to go to college. I thought I had it all figured out. I was going to continue lobstering and that was going to be that. And so the application process for college was so intimidating. And I feel like it's even more so now that I just resisted. And I did the common application and I sent it out to a bunch of schools and didn't really put a whole lot of thought into what schools offered what majors. And in hindsight, it's so crazy given the investment that college is and how much it can, but doesn't need to necessarily shape your life. I ended up going to Union College, which is a small liberal arts school out in Schenectady, New York, right near Albany. Union College doesn't have a marine biology program. Biology was the closest thing to marine biology. And when I got into those survey courses dealing with cell biology and physics and chemistry, which were not my strong suit at all, I was just overwhelmed. And that's where I was like, okay, maybe this isn't for me again. And I went back into that negative mindset, like I can't do this. And I started taking history classes. I've always been fascinated with history. And so I finished a history major in like a year and a half. And then there was an opportunity to do that term abroad, like I said, where we were able to go to Woods Hole. We spent a semester split between Woods Hole, Bermuda, and Newfoundland, studying the marine biology and the marine policy of those different areas. And as a kid growing up in Maine with lobster, I was used to a well-managed, sustainable fishery. You go down to Woods Hole and see the fishing port of New Bedford and the groundfish fleet there and the impacts of overfishing. And you go to Bermuda and see the reefs that have been depleted due to using fish traps, which are different than lobster traps, and just kind of do a lot of ghost fishing and seeing the impacts there. And then going up to Newfoundland and seeing the fact that the natural resource that brought Europeans to the colonies originally had been overfished to the point where there was a moratorium on codfish in Newfoundland by the time I was there in 1998. Like one of the most prolific fisheries in the world had been shut down due to overfishing and poor management. And so seeing all of that was a real eye-opener for me, like, oh, the rest of the world isn't like Maine's lobster fishery. And in fact, Maine's lobster fishery is kind of the exception to the rule when it comes to sustainable fishing. And it dawned on me the impact of science and management and how that can really play a role in maintaining fishing communities the way that we have here in Maine. And if our fishery isn't managed sustainable, then we're just as at much risk as any of these other places around the world. And that was a real eye-opener for me, and it allowed me to get back on that biology track at Union. All those classes were biology classes, and I was able to finish up with a degree in biology as well. And lo and behold, I get to the end of my undergraduate career, and I still have probably less of a clue at that point in time about what I wanted to do than I did at the end of high school. And I got on the old computer my senior year in the spring and looked at internships everywhere from Catalina Island to down in Florida. And all of a sudden an internship popped up studying lobster at UMaine. And I thought, oh, I'll throw my hat in the ring for that, not thinking I'd have a chance. And that chance was my lifeline. I got to study lobster with Dr. Rick Wally, who's a scientist at UMaine who just retired, studying lobster ecology, the early life stages of the lobster life cycle. And you talked about Bigelow and the challenge of communicating, the microscopic aspect of science. I had been around lobsters my entire life. And all of a sudden that summer, my first summer as an intern at UMaine, I was studying parts of the lobster life cycle that I didn't even know existed. We were studying the early life stages of the lobster life cycle. So when a lobster first hatches from an egg, we think of lobsters as these bottom-dwelling critters, which they are. But when they first hatch from an egg, those lobster larvae actually float up to near the surface of the ocean and spend the first month of their life near the surface going through 4 different larval stages. So the first part of a lobster's life is up in the water column. When they hatch, they actually look like an alien, a microscopic alien. And then over the course of those 4 lobster or larval stages, they start to look like a lobster, and they'll do test dives down to the bottom of the ocean. And what they're looking for is suitable habitat. So when you're a lobster the size of your thumbnail, suitable habitat is anything they can hide under to get away from all those hungry mouths around them. So we were doing research at that early benthic or bottom stage of the lobster life cycle. We were scuba diving 3 or 4 times a day, 4 or 5 days a week. It was just heaven for me. I loved scuba diving, and being able to scuba dive as a scientist, like this was just this whole other world that was opened up to me. And it was straight magic, the same way it was magic as an 8-year-old being able to go out in the boat and lobster. And again, it was one of those moments where I was able to develop that confidence that I didn't have in my abilities and realize, okay, maybe this is something that I could pursue. And it was right around that same time period that UMaine was starting up their dual degree program in marine science and marine policy. So it was a master's program where you could combine or get 2 different degrees, one in marine science and one in marine policy, but either work on it as one thesis or 2 separate theses. But given how intertwined those 2 fields are, it made all the sense in the world. And again, I fooled them into accepting me into that program, and that really set my career trajectory. I was able to work at GMRI on their research team for about 9 years after graduate school. And it was about 10 years ago now, after working at GMRI on a lot of fun collaborative research projects between industry and science, that saw an opportunity at Ready Seafood. And Ready Seafood is a live and processed lobster company that was started by my cousins, John and Brendan. And the name Ready is a family name. If we ever said Ready Seafood to our grandmother, she'd throw a sharp elbow into our ribs and say, it's not Ready, it's Rady. So it's a family name, but ultimately Ready comes from Rady, but it makes more sense from a business perspective to say Ready Seafood. So Ready Seafood was founded in 2004. A little over 10 years ago, we saw an opportunity to utilize research in a few different ways to improve both the sustainability and the quality of the lobsters and the lobster resource here in Maine. If you think about beef or pork or dairy and the amount of R&D that goes into those industries, it's astronomical. But when you think about seafood generally and lobster specifically, it's next to nothing. It doesn't exist. And so we saw opportunities there to develop a research program at Ready Seafood focused specifically on lobster. And for the last 10 years, it's just been such a fun, informative process. And I can dive into that, but I'll leave it right there for now if there was anything else that you wanted to talk about.
So, Curt, the best thing for me about this conversation that I get to have with you and other people is you have so much that you want to share and give information about that having me ask questions is rarely important. But I will say, I think one of the coolest things, the segue of your career and then having an honest to God for-profit business with a deep science focus happens, I think, more often than people realize. Probably the biggest example is pharmaceutical companies, right? And that's a whole other conversation that, I'm sure policy people and others can have, and we are not going to have that. But it seems to me it's a very unusual approach for a seafood processor or a seafood wholesaler to take, especially because unlike a pharmaceutical company, for example, you don't have this giant amount of control over what you're doing from the perspective of your product, right? Like there's so many variables to figure out. So that's been one of the reasons I've been this fangirl from far away watching you guys, because I think it's really interesting and really cool that you all have embraced this idea that science is a critical piece of it, which doesn't surprise me, but it's not a usual path, I think, for this area. But I am also curious, what does that translate into for you?
It's a great question, and a lot of different things. When we first started this research program at Ready Seafood, a lot of folks in our industry thought we were crazy, and I can assure you they're absolutely right. We are. But more than that, it was just something no one had done before. But our business revolves around a wild-caught fishery. We can manage that fishery better by understanding what's happening out in the wild better. So we saw an opportunity on the sustainability front. Additionally, we're sending live animals around the world on a daily basis. Live animals that typically live under the ocean surface. We ship them out of water. So the more we understand about their anatomy and physiology, the better we can do our job shipping live lobsters around the world. So sustainability and quality were really our two focus areas right out of the gate. And I'll touch on each of them, but none of where we have ended up was intended from the beginning. And I'll also, because you mentioned it, and I don't want to forget it, science generally, marine biology specifically, when you think of career opportunities, you think of academia, maybe management. But I'd emphasize that what I've learned through this process is there are so many opportunities for scientists in for-profit businesses. You mentioned pharmaceuticals, but any natural resource-based industry right now is looking for smart scientists to help them with their sustainability initiatives. ESG has become a huge part of corporate sustainability initiatives, and those really are in high demand. And I think maybe me talking about my experience over the 10 years can give a synopsis of how that can really fit into a business that it may not seem like a good fit initially. But when I first started at Ready Seafood as a scientist, it was all about, and it still is, it's all about collaboration. My goal is to collaborate with people smarter than me. And I can assure you that is not a limiting pool by any means. And we had an opportunity through Maine Sea Grant to put in a proposal with my former advisor from graduate school, Dr. Rick Wally, looking at those early stages of the lobster life cycle on the bottom of the ocean. And so we had a decent sense of how lobster settlement, or that transition from the water column to the bottom, was going in shallow water through scuba surveys, but there were a lot of questions about lobster settlement in deeper water. So we put in a proposal to look at how lobster settlement varied by depth along the coast of Maine in 2 different regions. We were very fortunate to get funding from Maine Sea Grant for a 2-year project back in 2016. And so this project essentially entailed filling cages full of rocks, setting those cages full of rocks throughout Casco Bay at 3 different depth strata and doing the same in Machias Bay in eastern Maine. We did that every June, come back in October at the end of settlement season, haul them all up, go through all those cages, measure all the baby lobsters, measure all the other critters that we were seeing in that cobble matrix, which is a real important ecosystem for baby lobsters, baby crabs, baby fish. Basically, it's daycare for all these different organisms. And what that gives us is an indicator of how lobster settlement varies by depth and also how it varies by region along the Maine coast, because oceanographically, the Maine coast varies considerably from the massive tides in eastern Maine to here in western Maine, where we have more of a stratified system. And then it also gives us an annual indicator of how things are changing. Obviously, climate impacts as well are a big part of this project. After 2 years, we were seeing some very interesting results, but Sea Grant funding ran out. And as a company, we said, we're seeing things we didn't think we would be seeing. We were seeing lobsters settling in much deeper water than we thought possible. And so we approached the university who we were collaborating with and said, would you be okay if we as Ready Seafood fund this project going forward? And we became the first private company to fund public lobster research so that we could keep this data set going. It was a unique industry science collaboration that had real value for our state, was providing new insights. And long story short, over the last 8 years, we've cobbled together funding from ourselves, from some of our suppliers. Cranberry Isles Fishermen's Co-op contributed 1/3 of the cost of the project for 2 years. Santa Monica Seafood out on the West Coast, one of our customers, contributed for 2 years. Red Lobster Restaurant Group has contributed 1/3 of the cost of the project for the last 5 years. And in the process, what we found, and I work very closely with our sales team now, which was never intended, what we found was by telling this story about science and sustainability to our customers, we were able to set ourselves apart from our competition. When I go around the country and around the world, our sales pitch is exactly what I'm talking to you about right now, showing pictures and videos of our research and showing folks things they've never seen before and really demonstrating our commitment to sustainability and the future of Maine's lobster industry so that our customers not only trust us with purchasing our products, but they trust us as a source of information as well. And again, that was never intended from the outset, but that's exactly what has differentiated Ready Seafood from our competition over the years. I think one of the things I'm most proud about over the years is the fact that a lot of our competition now has marine scientists on their team that I collaborate with on any number of different projects. Like, that is a win in my book. It makes our industry that much better. And so we are now in the 10th year of this research project that wasn't supposed to last any longer than 2 years. We've been really showing some fascinating data. Last year was the highest settlement that we've seen, both in Casco Bay and in Machias Bay. And I think one of the most important parts of this project is the fact that we're showing that lobsters are settling all the way down to 180 feet and probably deeper if we set collectors deeper than that. Before we started this project, it was assumed that lobsters don't settle in water deeper than 60 feet because it was thought to be too cold. So we're really flipping our understanding of that early life stage on its head and contributing to the great monitoring programs that Maine DMR does at different life stages and improving that understanding so that we can make decisions based on the best information possible. And that's another thing that science really helps management do. But this was just basic science that was originally intended to provide information. And now I find myself on an airplane more than I care to admit, traveling the country and the world with our sales team, talking about boring science, crazy, boring science. But lo and behold, it resonates and people are interested in it. And when I show them pictures of baby lobsters and when I show them videos of us doing science out on the water, it blows people's mind. And I remember I was down in Orlando at Red Lobster's headquarters. We gave a presentation and their first question was, how do we get involved in this project? We want to be able to tell our guests what we're doing to help the sustainability of Maine's lobster fishery, which is so important to their business model. That was never anticipated, never expected, but that's what has happened. And that's what I love about the job that I have now is there are so many opportunities to do different things. We collaborate with UMaine on that project. We collaborate with SMCC. We sneak into their radiography lab and x-ray lobsters when we can to learn more about lobster circulation. Steve Jury at St. Joseph's College right here in Maine. Ben Gutzler at the Wells Estuarine Reserve. They helped us develop a lobster Fitbit. Literally, we can track the heart rate of a lobster through the entire supply chain, learn where their stress points are, and then work to reduce them so that we provide our customers with better quality, healthier lobsters. That's all science. And it makes for a heck of a story, too. And so we use science in as many different ways as possible as a business, and it's really transforming our industry as a whole. And that's what I really get excited about, as you can probably tell.
You're making my job really easy here, Curt. I'm curious. I mean, I know lobster is the focus. And as a total aside, I love the fact that the hardcore science equipment that you use are rocks and a trap. Like that's
right.
It's really a solid argument that you can do science in all sorts of ways and not all of it's expensive. So I really enjoyed that. I guess I'm curious for a couple of things. If there is anything that you have learned about other ocean life while you've been doing the lobster research that you find not just interesting, but possibly helpful looking, 50 years down the road for Ready Seafood, I feel like I need to just put it out there. It's not a guarantee that the lobster industry is going to be what it looks like now, depending on how the ocean temperatures change and how the lobsters move. So is that something that is kind of in the back of your mind for that? That's the second question. The first question is, I'm just curious, are you also paying attention to other things besides lobsters?
Yeah, 100%. And to both of those questions, that's not back of mind. That is front of my mind every single day. Ready Seafood is the name of the company, but we deal with one species, lobster. And so when we're doing this research, we're collecting data. It's not just lobsters that find their way into these cages or these collectors. It's every species that is in that area at that time, from crabs to different fish species. And so we have a 10-year time series of everything from lobsters to Jonah crabs to green crabs to cunner, you name it. Anything that finds their way into those cages gets measured and then released back into the wild and goes into our data set. So we're tracking species composition over time and how it varies by region. But to your point about water temperatures in the Gulf of Maine, I mean, that the lobster has kind of become a poster child for climate change. And I cringe whenever I see that headline, because that headline often says the Gulf of Maine is warming, which it is, and lobsters are moving out of the Gulf of Maine, which they aren't. And I say that because we collect a lot of temperature data, and we do this in two different regions, in Eastern Maine and Western Maine. And one of the things that's never talked about in any of those news stories is the fact that in Eastern Maine, we have very mixed water. The big tides there mix that water, so we have a constant temperature from surface to bottom. Whereas in Western Maine, we have big tides, but they're not as big, so that water isn't as mixed. So we have more of a stratified system. And what that means is we have a warmer surface layer, but once you get down to depths below 30, 40, 50 feet, that warm water isn't mixed down. And so from May till about November, when we start to get bigger winter storms, water temperatures at depth are 3 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit colder in Western Maine than they are in Eastern Maine. So there's a depth component to that as well that never gets talked about. And that's why I always say, because I'll get reporters calling me from all over the country and all over the world to talk about this. And I try and talk about the nuance of this story. Do we keep our finger on the pulse of water temperatures? Absolutely. Every day I'm looking at Nirakus's website, which is a buoy array out in the Gulf of Maine that tracks water temperatures. Working with NOAA and Maine DMR, I have temperature sensors on my trap that every time I haul that trap that sits down in 200 feet, it uploads to the cloud and feeds into their data set. And so do dozens of other harvesters up and down the coast of Maine. Temperature is something that I track literally on a daily, if not hourly basis. And this is a big part of science too. When you see a headline like that, it's important to read it and understand it and look under the hood of what's actually being said, and then look at the data that feeds into those models. Like I said, Is the planet warming? 100%. We just had the hottest year on record, I read in the headline 2 days ago. But in different areas, that's going to mean different things. And so there's a local dynamic and a depth component to water temperature in the Gulf of Maine. And none of those temperatures are approaching the level that we would see that starts to threaten lobsters in the Gulf of Maine. Another thing that harvesters started to see, and this is the beauty of science and working with industry, this summer, harvesters out on the ocean in the Gulf of Maine started to see colder water temperatures than normal. And Chuck Bennett, who's a harvester out of Sorrento, Maine, east of Mount Desert Island, a little east of Acadia National Park, I tuned him into the Syracuse website, and he went on there and dug into it even more than I had and found this huge slug of colder, fresher, and by fresher, I mean low salinity water in the Gulf of Maine that scientists hadn't picked up on. And so we brought that to scientists at the University of Maine. Damian Brady started looking into it. And the thinking now is that there was a huge slug of probably meltwater from the Arctic that made its way in at depth through the Northeast Channel and has cooled water temperatures in the Gulf of Maine over the last year and a half. There was just a paper published by, the lead author was Nick Record from Bigelow Labs. And if you haven't talked to Nick would be the ideal candidate for this podcast. He is one of the most compelling, if not the most compelling scientist I've ever met. And he published a paper in Oceanography a few months ago documenting this new cold wave that has entered the Gulf of Maine. This is 100% a climate change story, but the key is change. Meltwater coming from the Arctic is going to continue to impact what we see in the Gulf of Maine. This year we saw that. Will we see that year after year? I don't know, but that really highlights the importance of monitoring. I was on the State Climate Council. Carl Wilson of DMR and I were the co-chairs of the Coastal and Marine Working Group. And one of the biggest things we pushed for was increased monitoring. The same way we're monitoring baby lobsters, we need to be monitoring temperature throughout the Gulf of Maine and beyond, like track water from the Arctic all the way down so that we can make decisions based on that information. And so that really is the power of science right there. I'm never going to sit here on a science podcast and deny climate change. Far from it. I've been around the world doing research, seeing the impacts. But what I've learned is it's not a one-way street. It's not one direction up, and there will be local impacts too. And so it just highlights the importance of monitoring so that we understand what's going on in real time so that we can feed the most accurate information into those models. That's why I love the term climate change as opposed to global warming. There will be changes. And I think that's a big part of what we're seeing right now, if that made any sense at all.
No, I think you make a really good point. The shortcut and the shorthand is that lobster is one of the, like you said, the poster child for climate change. And I think it makes a ton of sense to dive into that deeper. I think from my perspective, how lobstering has happened in Maine, and this is from the outsider's perspective of someone who knows nothing, how it has happened for the last 120 years, last 50 years, is going to change. There's just no way around it. So I would not be surprised if, the hub of lobster landings continues to move north for all sorts of different reasons, not least of which it'd be really interesting for me to continue to follow your research and see. You said, what was it? The first 4 stages of a lobster's life are in the upper water column. And that's where the warming's happening, right? So what's the impact there, right? Heather Hamlin has done all sorts of really interesting research about the acidification of the water. So it's not like lobsters are going away, but they're getting pummeled in all these different ways, right? So I think it's really interesting that lobsters are so much deeper than anybody realized. But I also think we need to remember what you said you learned early on in your science career is like, oh, wow, they're actually way up high. So what is what we're doing impacting that so they can then get to the part where they are down below, right? I don't know. And I think your point about monitoring is beyond critical. I was fortunate enough to have this really great conversation with Ian Pryor, who's a forester for 7 Islands. And he talked about basically like, yeah, I'm a forester, but I'm like I think he called himself like a fair weather forester. He's like, I'm not going out in the woods. He is looking at the data and the way that they're collecting it and doing deep dive data science, which is so cool and so not what kids in high school hear about rarely kids in college, unless they're lucky enough to have someone who's talked about it or they're their own special kind of geek. Like, it's a part of our world and understanding how science works that we don't talk about enough. It's the monitoring, which is vital, but then it's knowing what to do with that information. So I totally take your point. Like, lobstering isn't going away, but I think it will be very different because of climate change than what people have either in their head or how they've experienced it.
100%. I mean, you ask any old timer what the next year is going to look like, and he'll tell you, ask me on January 1st of next year. Like an anecdote, but like every year out on the water is different, and that will only continue to accelerate as things continue to change. Those larval stages are kind of the black box in our understanding because it's so difficult to track them. They're microscopic and there's no way. Well, I shouldn't say that. I think DMR is starting to try and tag them even at those larval stages. DMR in the last 3 years has also started a monitoring program looking at those life stages where they'll tow a plankton net along the coast and look at them over the course of time, the abundance of them over the course of, June through September or October. So that is a new monitoring program that's in place. We are so fortunate to have DMR doing the monitoring they're doing. We're so fortunate to have the university. We're working on a project right now with Bowdoin College in their coastal marine lab right up in Harpswell. Like, we have so many assets along the coast of Maine as far as academics and collaboration go. The sky is the limit to continue to work on these projects. We're only just scratching the surface. And before we wrap, I don't want to run out of time before I talk about the importance of education outreach. We're fortunate to source lobsters from up and down the coast of Maine, all of these amazing communities. So another part of what I do, especially in the winter when lobstering slows down, is we use the research that we do to go to schools and show students who might not be, like I wasn't, the best book learners in the world, how science can be local, relevant, and fun through the eyes of a lobster. Show them the lobster research we're doing and the opportunities to do science outside of what might be considered, the traditional career path. On Monday, I'm taking the ferry out to Vinyl Haven and talking with their skipper's class at the high school there, all about the research we do, giving them an update. And in the past, we've given schools their own cages with rocks so they can design their own experiments and be their own marine ecologist. And it's just so important for the future of our industry that we develop that passion for science and that interest in science and really emphasize how it's not just a chapter in a book, it's all around you. And for you students growing up on Little Cranberry Island, which is one of the most beautiful places in the world, if you choose to leave that island, science can be your ticket to the world. You can ask questions and make observations, not just along the Maine coast, but anywhere in the world. And science is your real ticket to travel and see the world and do all of that and really show kids that there's opportunity, because there is so much unique talent and ability, because so many Mainers along the coast live a very different life and have different life experience than a lot of other folks. So I get really passionate about that. Education outreach is such a cool component of what we do and one of my favorite parts of what I do as my job. And like I said, I'm so pumped to hop on that ferry on Monday and get back out to that beautiful school out on Vinyl Haven. And this will be the 5th or 6th year I think I've been working with the skipper's class out there. But science is all around us and it can be so much fun. It can be really heavy and backbreaking when you have to lift one of those cages full of rocks. But I always joke that we don't do rocket science, but we do rock science at Ready Seafood.
That's awesome. Curt, we could talk for hours here and I would feel like I've barely scratched the surface. So to be continued at another time. I really appreciate this. I think the only thing I would add to what you said about science and education is one of my many agendas is helping Mainers realize how extraordinary the science that happens here is, because not having grown up here and coming here and seeing it, I'm like, wow, they are killing it. And we don't appreciate how really world leading and transformative it is. And I think, what you're doing and the sustainable lobstering that has been going on for generations and generations is just one small example. So for all those kids, I love how you say science is your ticket to the world, 100%. And the other thing you can do with science in Maine is go tell the whole rest of the world what we have figured out, and maybe they can institute it too. So it goes both ways. So keep that in mind. You can leave and you come back, or you cannot leave and tell the rest of the world, this is what's worked for us. Maybe you guys can take it.
Stay here in Maine is my message. We need you. And I can't thank you enough for letting me take up your important time on this podcast. It does such important things and just gets the message out. So I'm really humbled just to be a small part of this, and really can't thank you enough for letting me be a part of it.
Thanks, Kirk. Thanks for listening to the Maine Science Podcast. Make sure you never miss an episode by following us on your podcast platform of choice. And please leave a rating and review. It will help more people find us and help spread the word about some of the remarkable people doing science in Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is recorded at Discovery Studios at the Maine Discovery Museum in Bangor, Maine. The Maine Science Podcast is executive produced and hosted by me, Kate Dickerson, and edited and produced by Scott Loiselle. And the Discover Maine theme was composed and performed by Nick Parker.